Well, I have 4:05, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. We have a full agenda, and we want to make sure we have plenty of time for dialogue. So I'd like to start by welcoming you to the AERA annual meeting. It's the first full day, and to this invited presidential session on evolving knowledge infrastructures in education, engaging diversity, illuminating inequities, and imagining possible futures. I'm Pamela Moss from the University of Michigan School of Education, and I've co-organized this session with my colleague Carl Lugosi, who's from the University of Michigan School of Information. Carl wasn't able to be with us today. I'm going to start us off with a definition of the term knowledge infrastructure as it's used by prominent theorists in science and technology studies and in information sciences. Drawing on their work, I'll also make a brief case for the importance of raising critical questions about knowledge infrastructures, especially now. Then each panel member will consider the role and potential of knowledge infrastructures in their own context of work, after which we'll open the floor for dialogue. I should note the session is being live streamed and video recorded. So during our open dialogue, if there are no microphones, please speak very loudly so that our participants who are on live stream can hear as well. So, what are knowledge infrastructures? Paul Edwards, Stephen Jackson, and colleagues define knowledge infrastructures as robust networks of people, artifacts, and institutions that generate, share, and maintain specific knowledge about the human and natural worlds. One of the authors of that paper is here with us and will be presenting shortly. Similarly, Christine Borgman views knowledge infrastructures as ecologies of people, practices, technologies, institutions, material objects, and relationships among them. Knowledge infrastructures enable us, as Jeffrey Bowker suggests, to turn observation and contemplation of the world into a standard set of knowledge objects. Still, most conventionally, our knowledge objects in education research are journal articles, books, and monographs. Why study knowledge infrastructures? Like other types of infrastructure, Sloda and Bowker explain they refer to prior work that does not need to be reconsidered at the start of a new venture. In other words, they reflect what we take for granted as the way things are done. Thus, our knowledge infrastructures can remain unnoticed as part of the background within which we work, and yet they can exert substantial power over how we work together and whose interests are privileged. Infrastructure studies, following Helena Karasti, call on us to make visible and worthy of investigation what typically remains invisible and unnoticed in the background. They raise critical questions about the history and consequences of the choices we've made. That's what Bowker calls infrastructural inversion. And they let us imagine how things could be otherwise. So that's the focus of our dialogue today. So why is attention to knowledge infrastructure study and design so important, especially now? Bowker argues that shifts in knowledge infrastructure of the magnitude the internet enables are rare in human history. During a period of emergence, it's possible to engage in play and experimentation, supporting intentional design. We have the opportunity to explore new forms of distributed collaboration across professional, disciplinary, organizational, and geographic boundaries. And we have the opportunity to develop new kinds of knowledge objects that go beyond static articles and books to enable dynamic connections between research and practice. Yet once the die is cast, Bowker cautions, the infrastructure choice seems inevitable. What we do now matters. This work is even more pressing because infrastructures never provide a neutral background that serves everyone's interests equally. They're value-laden, privileging some interests and disenfranchising others. Considering these consequences at the time of design is crucial. Here for the video record, I've just listed the full references for the citations I've been drawing on. To prepare for this session, each panel member read the report of a 2012 multidisciplinary conference sponsored by the U.S. National Science Foundation and the Sloan Foundation. The conference, or the report, was titled Knowledge Infrastructures, Intellectual Frameworks, and Research Challenges. The report was structured around 3 foundational questions that each panel member today will also address in the context of their own work. How are knowledge infrastructures changing? How do knowledge infrastructures reinforce or redistribute authority, influence, and power? How can we best study, know, and imagine today's and tomorrow's knowledge infrastructures? So we'll begin with an overview of key principles, concerns, and issues in knowledge infrastructure design and study by Stephen Jackson from Cornell, who was one of the co-authors of this report. Then each of 5 presenters will illustrate the role and potential of knowledge infrastructures in their own context of work, and we have a rich range of contexts to think about. So we'll be hearing from John Easton, the Spencer Foundation, Adam Gammaren from the William T. Grant Foundation, Chris Gutierrez from UC Berkeley, Carol Lee from Northwestern, and Daniel McFarland from Stanford. After that, there will be an opportunity for dialogue, first among the presenters, probably quite briefly, and then with you all, prompted by some additional questions. So just to give you a prefiguring of the additional questions, as you listen to the presentations today, you might keep these following questions in mind. What questions about knowledge infrastructures do you think are crucial for the field of education and education research to consider? What most worries you about current or future knowledge infrastructures? What most excites you? And then, what role might funders, professional organizations like AERA, government agencies, or other intermediaries play in supporting critical evaluation and evolution in our knowledge infrastructures? So I'll put these questions up again in an hour or so at the end of the presentations as props for our dialogue. But now I'm going to turn the floor over to Steve Jackson from Cornell. Let's see, where is, oh, it's Adams. Sorry. Okay.
All right, well, thank you, Pamela, and thank you to the rest of the panelists. I've had the privilege of seeing some of the slides in advance that people will be talking about. I can affirm what Pamela said. It's a really exciting session. And part of my, oops, I seem to have started in the middle. Part of my role here is to say a little bit about this knowledge infrastructure concept and the way that we've talked about it in our work, where it comes from, some of the aspects of it that we think are most important, and a little bit of update and some of the things that have evolved since the time of the report as well, because, you know, in the world of knowledge infrastructures, 2012 sometimes feels like a century ago. So I'm going to say, I'll give you some background, I'll talk about some themes, findings, and open questions, and then I'll talk a little bit about some extensions and emerging directions. So to give a bit more of a background, the report that we're talking about today is actually the second in a series of reports. Both of them were funded by the National Science Foundation, and the idea of them really is to gather what we know from history and comparative sociology about the development of large-scale infrastructures and think these into the worlds of knowledge that we're now engaging in our various ways. So the setup to this is that the US National Science Foundation was in the process of and about to invest billions of dollars in cyber infrastructure, and every so often they would make analogies. It's like, the internet is like the railroad of the 20th century, and this is going to be that transformative. And when you asked them about it, they really didn't know very much about the railroad of the 20th century. So part of our goal was actually to gather a very impressive grouping of historians and sociologists, a much larger grouping than appears on the report. Each of the workshops had sort of on the order of 20 or 30 eminent, for the most part, historians of technology and sociologists of science and technology. And the idea was, what can we learn from the histories of other kinds of infrastructures that can help us make better choices and decisions about the infrastructures we are, in fact, in process of building today. And so the first report was really primarily centered on the question of research infrastructures, mapping the NSF's interest in cyber infrastructure at the time and the way they thought about it. And the second one extends somewhat more broadly to consider knowledge infrastructures in a much more holistic and wide-ranging sense, including outside of the standard research or disciplinary settings that had been imagined in earlier reports. So one way of thinking about the function here is to ask, what can we learn from that, the thing on the left, the railroads, and many other infrastructures, water systems, road systems, electricity networks, all of which have rich histories within the history of technology that we can bring to make better choices around the kinds of cyber and knowledge infrastructures we're encountering today. And of course, railroads is one example, but there are a lot of the things that came up in the workshops as well, centered on earlier forms of knowledge infrastructures, going back, in some case, many centuries. So infrastructure is central to the generation, storage, and circulation of knowledge. So you've seen this slide before. That's what the report looks like. These are the three themes that are the central questions of the report. I guess I will call your attention maybe to the middle one, in keeping with the interest in this panel around power and inequality. One of the other things that we found most unsatisfying about the NSF discourse around cyber infrastructures at that time is that it was almost completely unsocially differentiated. Right? It had this idea, I guess there was a sense that a rising tide lifts all boats, or whatever that fallacy claims. So what we really wanted to understand is not only infrastructures, emerging infrastructures in their happy, progressive, promising moments, although I think there are many of those, but also to understand the negative consequences that can follow alongside the positive work. So if we think back to the railroad example, one of the things that historians of railroads will tell you is that the sort of the urban geography of the American Midwest in particular, but many other parts of the country, was substantially redefined by the railroads, right? The fact that a railroad went through your town meant that there were many sort of previously very small places that exploded in population. But what happened to the towns that the railroad did not go through, right? Those towns were equally involved in the process of railroad expansion. It's just that they were on the receiving end of it, right? And not in a positive way. So I want to flag that second question as a central one. And there's an epistemological question here around how we can best study, know, but also imagine today's and tomorrow's infrastructures. So that can be framed at the level of methodology. How do we conduct the kinds of studies that can help us understand these things better? But also, how can we collectively better imagine infrastructures that better support the kinds of worlds and objectives we want to see? Okay, so some key findings from history and sociology of technology. One of the things we were interested in was a sense, sort of a grounded sense, an empirically grounded sense of how, in fact, infrastructures change and grow. When we look at infrastructures, not in their moment of ideation or creation, but over the long sweep of their history. And within the history of technologies, there's a rich literature on momentum and path dependency, which brings us back to the point that Pamela made around the importance of initial choices. So the path dependency argument, which is most famously articulated by economic historian Paul David, is often tied to the figure of the typewriter, the QWERTY typewriter. The fact that the computer in front of me looks like the typewriter of whatever era that is, presumably 100 years ago or something like that, is a good example of path dependency. There's a long argument, sort of a famous case within the history of technology. The QWERTY keyboard, many of you will know, was in fact designed to be inefficient, right? It was designed to slow you down. And the reason they wanted to slow you down is if you type too fast under an old mechanical keyboard, the keys would stick, right? So they came up with, in some ways, the least efficient layout possible. You know, we now no longer tend to type on things that have mechanical keys that could collide, and yet we still type on a QWERTY keyboard. All right, so that's the lesson of path dependency. Initial choices, initial design shapes matter. There's also an interesting question about how systems scale from a discrete individual system into what my colleague Paul Edwards would describe as networks and internetworks, and from there to larger infrastructures. And there's a number of key moments in that transition that the report talks about, and I'll just name a couple of them. So if we think to the questions here, what we should be asking about are what are the breakpoints in knowledge infrastructure development? What are the key watersheds? What are the key transition moments? And how can we be more thoughtful about them? And what are the equivalents of the QWERTY keyboard story? Are we making choices now that are locking us into a future in ways that we may find suboptimal or regrettable down the road? There's an important question about how infrastructures grow and how infrastructures scale, which actually some of the panelists will also talk about in their cases, so I won't say a lot about that. There's an enormous interest in the report that I'll come back to later in the talk around standards and the role of standards as kind of a gathering point around which discrete practices can organize. So the fact that infrastructures can work at all, the fact that a train can travel from New York to Los Angeles depends on the fact that every step in the process along that way has been standardized in a way that supports a train traveling from New York to Los Angeles. To use a different example and to deploy this strategically, historically there were places in Europe where the trains could not travel, and that was on purpose, right? Because you didn't want a train to be able to travel, possibly a train carrying troops, all the way from one country into another country. So countries specifically selected rail gauges that did not line up, right? Recognizing the power of standards. Closely related to the standards point is the concept of gateways. So if you look at how infrastructures cohere and come together, there are often key gateway sites, key gateway technologies, key gateway actors or organizations that allow that kind of fusion or meeting point to happen. So when we think about knowledge infrastructures, what or who are the gateway technologies, organizations, and people? What steps can be taken to support and extend such bridging work, which is another language for the same principle. This gets back to the point about the railroads and the towns forgotten by railroads, but the report is also very interested in problems of inclusion and exclusion, or what is sometimes thought about as the insides and outsides of infrastructure, or what my late colleague Lee Starr talked about as infrastructural orphans. What does it mean to be the person on the outside of a standard? What does it mean to be a person who, for whom the world is not set up, right? The world that, you know, the new infrastructural setup that makes the world better for the 99 other people. What does it mean to be the one person who is materially disadvantaged by that? One of the things we encounter in the computing world, for example, is around what's often described as the revolution, the graphical user interface, or the GUI revolution, which was great if you could see, right? But if you had sight issues, many people who had built workarounds that effectively accessed lots of information under the old command line system were deeply disadvantaged. They saw their access to computing substantially undercut by this, in other people's eyes, wonderful revolution. So who gains and who loses through KI development, and what are the available mechanisms if there is a gain and a loss for inclusion and possibly redistribution? Final point I'll make is around innovation and incumbency, and the problem that as we build old and then new infrastructures, those infrastructures gain power in the world and take on a certain kind of incumbency effect. So one of the areas I work in is technology, law, and policy, and I get to talk to my students all the time about the history of AT&T. And of course, AT&T is often cited as in some ways, a pioneer, very important company. Also has a certain kind of incumbency effect that back in the day had a deep distortionary effect on the future of American telecommunications. So who are the incumbents of KI development? Universities. If we want to think back to earlier moments, you can think of universities as an incumbent in this world, in the higher education world. Are there things about the status of universities, the incumbency status of universities, that may in fact, for example, be delaying us or pulling us away from otherwise very positive developments? And you can multiply this. Okay, a couple of quick updates just to point to current work. I've been doing a lot of work lately on the relationship between standards, innovation, and change. I do a lot of work with ecologists in particular, both sort of older style field ecologists and new computational developments in ecology. And the interesting thing that we've been playing with there is to understand standards not only as a mode of constraint, which they sometimes are, but also understand the potential linkage between standards and innovation. So the somewhat odd picture in this context, in the bottom right is Thelonious Monk. We're in New York. We're actually not so far from some of the clubs he used to play in. And Thelonious Monk is a great example of a jazz musician who used standards as a vehicle to innovation. Standards have this really interesting place in jazz music. I've been doing a lot of work on collaboration and improvisational learning and thinking about how modes of engagement with musical communities, experimental music communities, and experimental art communities can in fact support forms of learning that live more in the world of improvisation, again connecting to jazz, than they might in a formal pedagogical world. And finally, I've been doing a lot of work around sustainability, maintenance, and repair, and the absolute, if you remember one thing from this talk, the absolute centrality of maintenance and repair work to knowledge infrastructures. And this is important because often the way we think about knowledge infrastructures is that all the energy and imagination and creativity and effort goes into the founding of these then presumably systems that just float along sort of continuously, when in fact, point to any knowledge infrastructure, any infrastructure that works, that continues to work, and you will see a whole world of maintenance and repair underneath it. And so I've been doing a lot of work actually with mobile phone repair communities in Namibia and Uganda, and these images are mostly from Bangladesh. All right, so I will wrap up here. I want to conclude by noting the error of both of these pictures that I shared with you earlier as emblems or representations of infrastructure, old or new. And the obviously error or missing piece here is that there are no humans. And the other point to note is that they're both entirely too fixed, certain, and under some imaginations, secure. So if infrastructures take work to build, they take just as much work and imagination to maintain, modify, care for, and extend. And that brings us really back to the core interests of the panel. And rather than speaking for the wonderful presentations that you're about to hear from everyone else, I will turn it over to them. So, thank you.
So, John, we're going in alphabetical order by last name. And I will get your PowerPoint up.
So I thought it'd be a good idea for me to start off with asking the question of who am I and why am I here with these august, deep thinkers? I think of myself as an applied education researcher. I've had a lot of luck in my career. I'm now at the Spencer Foundation, where I'm vice president for programs. Before that, I was the director of the Institute of Education Sciences. But for decades before that, I worked in Chicago, sometimes at the University of Chicago Consortium on Chicago School Research, and sometimes in the Chicago Public Schools. And these experiences have made me a a real true believer in this idea of what we call research practice partnerships. And these are arrangements between researchers and practitioners that I think are really potentially, have great potential for increasing research use. And it's kind of a simple reason that we've got partners, both of whom have some skin in the game. So there are greater reasons for doing relevant, usable research, but on the practice side, there's also reasons for taking it up because there's some investment in that. About 4 years ago, Adam, the William T. Grant Foundation, commissioned a paper by Cynthia Coburn, Bill Penuel, and Kimberly Guile on this idea of what are research practice partnerships. And this, this paper has become sort of a go-to repository for those of us who want to define what a research practice partnership is. And in this work, which was empirical work, because these 3 researchers reached out and they did a landscape scan and so forth, they found there were 5 major characteristics of research practice partnerships. And the first that I have up there is mutualism, that this is a joint endeavor. Both sides are equally committed to doing the work. So this is not a researcher going out to a school district and say, can I collect data in your site? But on the other hand, it's not a school district hiring a firm to answer a question. These research practice partnerships tend to focus on a specific practice or problem. And many of them at least strive to be long-term. And this long-term component turns out to be really important because knowledge can really accumulate. Studies can build on one another. You can really learn a lot about a particular topic, sometimes in one location, but sometimes across many sites. There are also these intentional efforts to make this a partnership. There are routines involved, there are memoranda of understanding, and there are commitments. And the final criteria is that they do original research. In this paper from a couple of years ago, I guess it's 5 years now, the authors identified 3 types of research practice partnerships. The first, they call place-based research alliances, and the place where I used to work, the Chicago Consortium, is one of them, but there are many across the country: Baltimore, New York City, San Diego, Madison, Wisconsin. Another approach is design research, where researchers and practitioners choose a particular problem. Let's say improving the academic vocabulary of middle school kids, or working on conceptual math in the middle grades. And a real good example of this is an organization called Strategic Education Research Partnerships, headed by a woman named Suzanne Donovan. And finally, we're seeing a lot of activity on networked improvement communities, and much of this has been catalyzed at the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching by Tony Bright. We're in the process, W.T. Grant Foundation and the Spencer Foundation, of refreshing this paper because we think that there's been a change in the landscape, that there's rapidly moving environment, that there are hybrids and there are new types, and we want to understand that a little better to guide our grant making and to also help us set our priorities. So I want to switch a little bit and talk about research use and maybe oversimplify things. This is something that Adam Gamron's colleagues and he know a lot more than I do about. But I want to start with this kind of a traditional model of research to use, which is the research to practice, kind of the one-way street dissemination model. Don Purak, in a recent paper, calls this research design, dissemination, and utilization. If you know IES, you might be thinking of, well, you develop something, you validate it, you scale it up, and this is really epitomized in the What Works Clearinghouse. We find validated programs, and we adopt them. I think increasingly people from all across the spectrum sort of are understanding that this push model isn't working very well, that proven programs need adaptation, context matters a lot. So we've gotten more to this two-way street idea of research use. I was at a conference recently and I heard Tony Bright say, good scholarship should have a productive relationship with practice. Now this kind of work is organized in many different ways, but there's sort of an umbrella heading here, maybe continuous improvement research, heard the name collaborative problem-solving research. These are all research practice partnership-like, and we see design-based research, we see community-based research, improvement science, and design-based implementation research. So my argument here is that first model, that research to practice model, that push out the research model, has developed a very strong infrastructure that really privileges this work in ways that I don't think are necessarily productive at this point. I'll give you a few examples of this infrastructure that have developed quite quickly, actually. Just over the last 10 years, there's a professional organization called the Society for Research and Educational Effectiveness. It has its own journal, which is, by citation counts, a high-impact journal. The Institute of Education Science provides training grants through both research centers. I looked on the web the other day. In these 10 years, there have been 36 grants, each of which were between $4 and $5 million. So this is a lot of money, training, rigorous methods. There are very popular summer courses in multi-site RCTs, QEDs, and single case designs. There's grant money for efficacy and effectiveness testing. Perhaps less well known is that through the National Center for Educational Evaluation, IES sponsors a lot of very strong technical papers on very difficult methodological problems that are a huge resource for the field. And another thing that I think is quite important is that What Works Clearinghouse has really developed robust quality standards, and they certify trainers. So there's a real seal approval here. There's little ambiguity about what makes a good RCT. And at the same time, there are at least 4 or 5, half a dozen flourishing, robust, big firms that have really high reputations for great work. So my argument here is that there's a lot of prestige attached to this work. There's a strong emphasis on rigorous methods, internal validity, and causal warrants, and that this infrastructure is privileging this work. So to shift a little bit again, the Spencer Foundation is in a year of transition. We have a new president, and we're spending a year kind of on listening tours, reaching out. What should we be doing differently? And I've been making visits to campuses and talking to education professors and asking questions about what are your burning questions, what's in your way, what are some of the big questions that education research should solve. And I do not claim to have made a careful qualitative analysis of this data, but a couple of things have really jumped out at me. Someone said, I love the RPP vision, but the methodology isn't well developed. There are too few how-tos in learning to work side by side with practitioners and policymakers, and there are few incentives for conducting sustained long-term research. So in a very related model, several people said something like, I want to move out of the siloed researcher model, and that we need to pay more attention to the social side of research and to learn to collaborate across disciplines. And trust and relationships are important. What I want to stress here is this across boundaries isn't just between research and practice, but it's also across discipline and across method. So this RPP, Research Practice Partnership Improvement Model, are really popular right now, partly because of national legislation and national foundations. But I see a number of threats here that I think we need to address. Some traditional academics question the legitimacy of this work. There's clearly a lack of recognized quality standards. There's little research or understanding of how to do this work, in what context is the best approach most appropriate. And there is also not a lot of communication among proponents of the various methods that I talked about. So going quickly, we are building infrastructure here. There's a national network for education research practice partnerships with 27 members, something called Learn DBIR, the Strategic Education Research Practice Partnership. And the National Implementation Research Network is closely related. IES and Spencer have made 68 grants to partnerships. The use of research evidence program at the WT Grant Foundation is vibrant. And together we're continuing to commission papers and convening. So what more can we do? How do we continue to build this infrastructure? I think our special, one thing that little private foundations can do, even those of us without a lot of money, we have a lot of convening power, and we can catalyze things, so we should keep at this. We should also help people think about new training programs that cross boundaries, not just research and practice, but disciplines and methods. I think this notion of quality standards is really important. Not only do we build them, but we actually test them. We apply them to test cases. I want to say a little bit, I think we should be pushing the field like an improvement science to actually explore the commonalities that they actually have with some experimental designs, like sequential multiple assignment randomized trials. And I'm over time. But what I really want to say is the way to think about the knowledge infrastructure that we need is that we have to understand the school improvement process. And we have to understand how schools get better. We have to learn more about training of school and district leaders. We need more spaces for interactions among these folks. And we have to recognize that the way schools and systems are built right now, they're really not open to learning and innovation in the way that they need to do. So finally, I want to just mention two recent books, each of which describes cases of educational improvement. Restoring Opportunity by Greg Duncan and Dick Bernane, and The Ambitious Elementary School by Elizabeth Hasbrook, Steve Roudenbush, and Lisa Rosen. And these do a nice job of showing examples of exemplary educational practices with outcomes. But in every case that they cite, it's not the research use, is this more iterative back and forth. I heard a psychologist from UCLA named Bruce Chorpita the other day talk about the enlightened use of evidence and building evidence-based thinkers. So that's where I think we need to be building our infrastructure now. Thank you.
Okay, how many of you are on Twitter? Okay, Okay, if you're on Twitter, take out your phone right now, follow the William T. Grant Foundation, because the foundation just tweeted 2 grants announcements. And while we were listening, I just tweeted out a link to the paper that John mentioned on research practice partnerships. And after I sit down, I'll tweet out the link to the paper that Stephen Jackson spoke out, which is this. So we didn't plan this. It's all right, I can handle it. We didn't plan this, but it turns out that, well, Stephen's paper asked 3 questions, and John had a lot to say about the first question, which is, how are knowledge infrastructures changing? And something to say about the third question is, how should we be studying knowledge infrastructures? But I'm going to talk mostly about the second question, which is how do knowledge infrastructures reinforce or redistribute authority, influence, and power? So our worst fears have been realized. Since the publication of the report in 2012 by Edwards and Jackson, the concerns they raised in the report have come true. Cambridge Analytica's harvesting of data from 87 million Facebook users and targeting subsequent posts to push an agenda, that's just the one case we know about. There's no doubt scores of cases just like this, because that's the whole point of gathering information on Facebook users. So change requires not just new science. We've seen the new science, and it has brought change. But the change we're looking for also requires new norms that resolve the tensions that Stephen mentioned. Free and open data are valued, but can be used for ill as well as for good, as we can most clearly see. To develop new norms, we need to decide, ultimately, what do we really want? Do we want everything for free? And we're going to have to take ads. There's no way around it. Do we want to protect our privacy? Do we want to limit content that we're exposed to? These are choices. Of course, we need to understand what the situation is that we're confronting before we'll be in position to make educated choices. I think that's, we can all see very clearly that's where we are today. So, clearly, as I say, the fears expressed in this report have come true, but that's not really what I'm going to focus on today, because my interest is not nearly this broad. My focus is on the use of evidence from research for policy and practice. The William T. Grant Foundation is focused on young people ages 5 to 25 in any setting. Of course, education, but other settings like mental health, like justice, like housing, like child welfare. But today, since we're at the AERA, we'll examine education. So the question that I will confront is, what sort of knowledge infrastructure is best suited to improving the use of research evidence for education, policy, and practice? So I'm focusing, as I say, on the second of Edwards, Jackson et al.'s questions. How can knowledge infrastructures be set up to distribute rather than concentrate knowledge, authority, and power? My argument is that if we create knowledge infrastructures that are more distributed and less concentrated, then we are promoting a democratic society. Now, the use of evidence from research in education, policy, and practice is all too rare. All of us in this room have written research reports, thrown it over the wall, expecting naturally the policymakers would gravitate to our pearls of wisdom, but that rarely happens. In fact, when evidence use does occur, it often has a tactical purpose, meaning, tell me what research you've done that supports the policy decision I've already made, as opposed to an instrumental use. Oh, I need to make a decision. Let's see what the research says. Or a conceptual use, where we use research to help understand the problem more deeply and identify a solution set. Limited use of evidence is often attributed to a weak supply of evidence. The research is not timely, it's not relevant, it's not accessible, or it's of poor quality and can't be trusted. Yet the supply of evidence has greatly improved, and here I'm intersecting with some of what John reported, partly from technological improvements such as those described by Stephen, but also from longitudinal data systems, from other types of data collection like video, from state and district dashboards and news accounts that make evidence visible to a wide public, from increased attention to standards for evidence. For example, we should only make causal claims if we've got a research design that supports causal inference. The What Works Clearinghouse and other aggregators have made research evidence more widely available than ever before. Think tanks, advocacy groups, policy organizations are making evidence accessible to policymakers as well as the general public. Timely, relevant, accessible? Yes. Improved quality? Very often. Of course there are problems, and I'd love to spend the next hour going into what all the problems are, but I won't. Instead, I'll just assert we now have a much better supply of evidence than in the past. But the real bottleneck in getting evidence used is not supply, but demand. It's not about the quality of evidence, but it's about the quality of relationships between producers and consumers of evidence, and the intermediaries who often bring producers and consumers together. Sustained relationships between those who produce evidence and those who use evidence allow trust to develop, which is a key element in the proliferation of evidence use. Research practice partnerships, as John described before me, are a way to structure and sustain relationships of trust in education systems. So take a look at my Twitter feed. I just gave you the Coburn, Penuel, and Guile paper on what we mean by research practice partnerships. School districts and universities work together, but they're increasingly found in research practice partnerships, but they're increasingly found at the state level as well. And there's a national network of research practice partnerships. Partnerships are also emerging in higher education, such as the networked improvement communities promoted by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. A key aspect of research practice partnerships is that they jointly construct a research agenda to ensure that the research that's carried out is relevant to the decision making necessary on the part of the policymakers and practitioners. And this then supports a culture of evidence in the school district. It also makes administrative data through a memorandum of understanding available to researchers. So can we ensure that research practice partnerships distribute rather than concentrate evidence? Well, if it's truly a two-way street, then I think we are serving this aim of distribution. If the research that's undertaken is not motivated purely by the curiosity of the researcher and not solely by the demands of the discipline to test theories in psychology or sociology or economics, but instead is a two-way street where the researcher is listening to the practitioner and vice versa, when there is engagement rather than dissemination. This is something at the William T. Grant Foundation we're really trying to push. We researchers, we always have a dissemination plan. We want to get rid of dissemination. We want an engagement plan. How will you work with relevant audiences to make sense of your research finding and apply them to the specific context that they face? We talk about democratizing evidence, and by that we mean bringing input from those for whom the evidence matters into decisions about what evidence should be generated. So I'll give two examples of how we're doing this. The first is a grant that we announced this week, the winner of the first grant, the Institutional Challenge Grant. The Institutional Challenges Grant challenges universities to develop a partnership with a public agency or a private nonprofit to jointly construct and execute a research agenda, to build capacity within the public agency or nonprofit to use research evidence in its decision making, and to build incentives within the university to value and reward partnership-oriented research. I was really struck by one of the quotes that John put up. I love the vision of the research practice partnerships, but we're not set up to value and reward that kind of work within universities. So in our Institutional Challenge Grant, that's exactly what we're challenging universities to do, to understand work undertaken in partnership with a school of education, or in the case of our first award, a community agency, not a service, but as research. Making a research contribution, not to testing theories, but to practical and policy decisions. The second example are rapid research response grants. So here we are awarding grants to universities or research firms to work in partnership with a public agency or nonprofit where research already exists. And what needs to be done is to synthesize the existing research and contextualize it so that it can respond to a pressing need of the public agency. We've chosen problems that are pressing today. Problems of immigration, problems of LGBT youth, problems of recovery from the hurricane in Puerto Rico, problems of settling refugees. These are the kinds of problems that are addressed by the Rapid Research Response Grants. Like the Institutional Challenge Grant, they represent partnerships between researchers and agencies, but the research already exists and needs to be synthesized. And when the applications come in, they must come in with an engagement plan driven by the partner, by the public agency. The public agency has to say, if only I had this research, I would know what to do, or I would have some additional guidance around problem X. And that's the nature of it. For example, the Genders and Sexualities Alliance of Texas wanted to develop a toolkit to help high schoolers combat the discrimination and bullying that they face. And they needed the research to be synthesized. So we gave a grant to Stephen Russell at the University of Texas at Austin to work with the Texas Genders and Sexualities Alliance to synthesize and apply it to that specific context, a very challenging context for confronting that problem. So in conclusion, a knowledge infrastructure that distributes rather than concentrates authority, influence, and power requires at least three elements. First, it needs to be deliberately structured. You can't expect it just to emerge from the brilliant writing that we researchers do and throw out there and cast to the wind for policymakers to pick up. It requires deliberate structure. Second, it requires a joint pursuit of knowledge. If researchers are the only ones deciding what knowledge gets generated, it's unlikely that knowledge will be widely distributed. In fact, it's more likely to be concentrated. So distributed knowledge means jointly constructing the questions that are asked and the analyses that are pursued. And third, a shared engagement where the researchers and policymakers or practitioners engage together on applying the new knowledge to specific situations which call for questions to be answered. Thank you.
Okay, you just want the slides. I'm going to, all right. You want just start so you can go to the slide. Okay. So, yeah. Or if you want to advance it, you just go, you just click. And you click there. Are you okay with that size? I don't know. Yeah, sure.
Good afternoon. I don't represent a foundation. I will attempt to, I can't say represent, but speak with another kind of community. I think a community which is often the object of our analysis, but communities that are not often at the table to make decisions about knowledge infrastructures. So I call it Designing for Possible Futures. My brief remarks today are organized by several questions advanced in the report that ask, how do knowledge infrastructures reinforce or redistribute authority, influence, power, and control? And how can we best study knowledge and imagine today and tomorrow's knowledge infrastructures? The report asked, how do changes in knowledge infrastructures reinforce or redistribute authority, influence, and power? Their reported goal was to seek or to inspire new ways of thinking around issues that have been obscured by older approaches and assumptions, some of them in the process of being undermined and remade by the very forces described in that report. Changes associated with internet technology, such as social media, big data, open source software, ubiquitous computing, and Wikipedia, have all altered the basic mechanics by which knowledge is produced and circulated, they say. This report makes evident the ways infrastructures and all tools have enabling and constraining properties. And while much attention has been given to the enabling, in general, not the report, have been given to the enabling dimensions, for which there are many, much more attention should be focused on how expanding infrastructures can exacerbate inequality. Consider the notion of the ubiquity of the internet. Indeed, it is. Yet many families in the US and surely globally cannot afford to pay for broadband support to ensure any sustained benefit resulting from changing knowledge infrastructures. We see how problematic notions of the digital divide in early technology and other such metaphors, how inadequate they were, as they certainly did not address fundamental issues of social, economic, and educational inequity resulting from changing knowledge infrastructures, or the attending material, technical, and social processes that are part of them. Even less attention, I think, has been given to the knowledge, values, and practices of non-dominant communities, how knowledge is constructed, circulated, and made consequential in these communities, and how these new infrastructures have been reframed and utilized in substantive and ingenious ways. We know from our own studies that families from non-dominant communities leverage new media with ingenuity and purpose. As the Focal report continues, transformative infrastructures cannot be merely technical. They must engage fundamental changes in our social institutions, practices, norms, and beliefs. For that reason, many scholars have dropped the dualistic vocabulary of technical and social altogether as anything other than a first-order approximation, replacing those terms with concepts such as collectives, assemblages, configurations, in which the technical and social figure as no more than moments or elements within which are at their core heterogeneous and uneven, but ultimately united wholes. I thought that was one of the key points of this report, a point that resonates with an orienting question. How can we best study, know, and imagine today and tomorrow's knowledge infrastructures? A point I hope to get to in my remarks today. But first, their argument, at least part of it, as I understand it, takes me to the work of Bowker and Lee Starr, Bowker, who was one of the authors, who have written about infrastructure, categories, and their consequences, and how technologies can be designed and continue to be designed to produce valued knowledge with an emphasis on what values we deem important. Their analysis, which is a critical feminist sociology of science and technology view, helps us see how the world gets built materially, symbolically, and culturally to advance some forms of knowledge and not others. They draw attention, Lee Starr's work in particular, to how infrastructure, which is typically invisible until it breaks, supports the way the world functions. Starr and Strauss, for example, work together to develop ideas about invisible work. This points to one of the challenges in empirical work, that is, about making the invisible visible, certainly a focus in my work. One of the best examples of scholarly work that made infrastructure visible to illustrate how inequity gets constructed is found in Chuck Goodwin, the late Chuck Goodwin, my dear colleague and friend, his classical piece, Professional Vision, in which he meticulously demonstrated how new media and ways of analyzing media were reframed to find the police who beat Rodney King innocent. What Goodwin so brilliantly demonstrated was the importance of paying attention to the material and technical processes at work, rather than the processes inside the head. But the work was also hopeful, as it makes visible the possibilities of new tools and new leverage points to make the knowledge and lives of all people consequential. I return to Lee Starr's work as she was interested in how the world gets built to advance some views of practice, views and practices that benefit some but also make others suffer. Attention to how people's lives get organized requires attention to all facets of infrastructure, as it helps us understand what the heck people are believing and valuing and why. This is why, following Soja's work, it matters for people to think about geographies of consequentiality, issues involving who has transportation, how are cities planned, etc., etc. These ideas have also been expanded in the work on representational infrastructures, such as the work of Rogers Hall and Susan Giroux, who in their analysis of consequential learning argued the importance of understanding how representational infrastructures support conceptual practices and how they change, either implicitly or by deliberate effort over social history or shared practice, and why this is important both from the perspective of analysis, but also to the participants in those practices. Underlying all this work is the question, how consequentiality gets built. Turning to my own work with Giroux, Vosogyi, Espinosa, and the Berkeley Prolepsis Collaborative, questions regarding what is consequential for communities are critical for the study and design of learning. Answering these questions requires knowledge of how the social world functions to make certain ideas, practices, and identities visible and potentially valuable. Consider Giroux's longitudinal and participatory design research project, in which she worked with a group of resident activists seeking social justice for their historically marginalized community. She writes, "Our aim was to develop new tools and understandings that could make learning consequential. Without making different scales of influence and values of participants' work visible, possibilities for consequential learning, learning that extends across multiple positions and perspectives and practices, such as community organizing, would be limited." Thus, our collective work has been organized around an assemblage of commitments around what is visible and what is invisible, when, to whom, and why, and how are power and privilege implicated. We are concerned with how institutions, their tools and practices, support equity and opportunities for transformational forms of learning. The focus on power dynamics, different forms of positionality and privilege, and the divisions of labor help make visible a more robust analysis, make it fundamental to doing collaborative work. We have tried to take up the challenge about what can researchers do. Our response has been to engage in what I have termed social design-based experiments that are concerned with how to engage with networks of people, specifically non-dominant communities, to reorganize the world to make it beneficial and equitable to these communities. A distinguishing feature of our work has been to foreground equity as a central design principle, as equity is often used as the rationale for design, but rarely remains instrumental across the design, its implementation, reiterations, and reported outcomes. A focus on participatory design is central, making the social relations a fundamental consideration of the work, continually asking who benefits from the design and how, whose knowledge gets privileged and how. The approach simultaneous focus on historicity and the specificity of context requires new ways of engaging in community and institutional partnerships. I was struck by the point in the report about knowledge being in perpetual motion, because it aligned very much with my notion about learning as movement and the importance of studying people across institutions and activity systems to understand better how repertoires of knowledge and practice are developed and how they travel. This has been one of the reasons for our resistance to traditional notions of scaling up. It is the importance of the local specificity and the history of people's practices and values that are central to social design-based experiments. Instead, we are interested in creating horizontal networks, what Espinosa and Vosogyi call sister projects, that are nodes in larger networks that cohere in principled ways without sacrificing the contextual and historical features that are central to the sustainability and the value of the project. So in the 1 minute I have left, I wanted to tell you, a minute and a half, just take you through a little bit of what the heck social design-based experiments and why I think they can be distinguished from other kinds of design-based research. As I mentioned earlier, equity is foregrounded in this approach, but we have a number of other kinds of commitments that we think are central to really understanding, to work with communities, to understand those communities, their histories, their values, and the knowledge that's circulated in those communities. So very quickly, these are the design principles that really organize the way we study. There's attention to historicity, prolepsis, which is organizing learning in the present for the future, diversity, remediation, which aligns very much with the iterative and fixing the reconstruction notion that you talked about, transformability, resilience, and sustainability. So our basic commitments have been that we aim to make possible a sustainable and dignified life for all humans. And in doing that, we must fundamentally address the challenges of leveraging cultural diversity and reducing social inequality. This involves co-designing with communities for new futures. So in the minute I have left, let me just highlight some of when our commitments lead us to seek deep understandings of the resources and constraints of the ecologies that constitute people's everyday lives. So it's a very ecological approach, so that we can capture the full range of people's practices understood across several activity systems, that learning is movement that I just talked about. And our interest in documenting people's repertoires of practices, including the genesis of those practices, to understand why certain practices and forms of knowledge are made consequential in particular kinds of communities. And finally, our goal is to support the development of what we call historical actors, people who learn to understand their histories, reframe that history as a resource to bring it into the present for future action. This involves working side by side, guided by mutual relations of exchange, turning data into prisms that refract contradictions and potential sites of challenges and changes in our work. And I think I'm at my end, so I will stop here. Thank you.
I'm Carol Lee from Northwestern University, and I'm so glad that I'm following Chris. We're like our sort of sister groups here. I want to approach the question from a slightly different point of view than what has been discussed so far, but I think it grows nicely out of Chris's comments, and that is to begin to wrestle with the question of the warrants that we're using for knowledge that potentially would be distributed in some way through the structures that we create. And for me, this goes to the question of what are the fundamental warrants for knowledge production? And what does it mean at this particular point in the history in the social sciences and the biological sciences, which I think intersect quite nicely, to begin to sort of reimagine, if you will, what forms the basis for debates that we have about knowledge production. And part of this sort of historicity, if you will, around knowledge production in our field, certainly in all the fields that contribute to education, certainly in the social sciences, but also I think there are implications in the biological sciences, which I'll get to, is understanding that there's an ideological sort of foundation that's entailed in knowledge production and has been. So that in many respects, many of the challenges, the equity challenges that we're addressing now and that we have historically, have really been fueled in many respects in our research by some fundamental assumptions about a presumed hierarchy in human communities. And these hierarchies of human communities have very much, certainly in the West, certainly in the United States, been informed by notions of constructions of race. I would suggest that, I think I have a slide with the cover of it, but the April edition of National Geographic has some very powerful articles that are really leading us to wrestle with this very construction of this concept, excuse me, of race. It's important, for example, to remember that the American Psychological Association was established by eugenicists. And the ways in which we still continue in social science research to use constructs like race as predictors of this, that, or the other. Certainly that race as a social construction is going to be important for explaining certain things, but it's not fundamental for explaining fundamental issues around understanding human learning and development. We have moved at a point, I think, in terms of these sort of meta-narratives about differences across human communities now, where poverty has become the new term essentially for race. And so now we have bunches of research, certainly even in practitioner settings, about how poverty affects the brain, which then people presume that they're calling on work in neuroscience to somehow make claims that there's something inherently disempowering about poverty. The fact of the matter is most human beings across the globe live in poverty that we cannot imagine. And if poverty in and of itself was a fundamental determinant to human development, I always say it would be the viruses and the like that would rule. They may be ruling now as it is anyway. Then some of the dilemmas that I think we face is that while we have these technical infrastructures, which John and Adam have done a wonderful job in describing, the wonderful point in time I think that we are, both in terms of affordances of technology, but also various infrastructures that have established. John laid out a whole range of those that sort of provide these technical mechanisms, if you will, for distribution, sharing of knowledge. And yet these still get informed by policy issues that I think are a real challenge for us in terms of really understanding, if you will, the science of policy making, because I think we work from a fundamental assumption that there's somehow a logic that we have in the research community, and if we are able to convey that logic to people engaged in public policy, that somehow that may be taken up. But I don't think that's the science of policy making. It's really the science of sort of a whole set of issues. So questions around the politics of, for example, who gets funded by these various infrastructures that are set up. So I refer back, for example, under NCLB, the Reading First initiative, at the point where there was clear debates in the reading community between people who were focusing on whole language and those who were focusing on decoding. If you were to do, for example, a social network analysis, which some people have done around the structures, if you will, and the social relationships through which the decisions came about what IES, in fact, was going to fund, which was in favor of the whole decoding piece, it really wasn't a matter of simply of logic. It was about sort of power dimensions in terms of debates, and we didn't have real infrastructures for debating the source of our differences. Ended up that they funded a tremendous amount of funding, for example, in Reading First. When they finally did the comprehensive assessments, what they found was that kids got better at decoding, but they didn't get any better at comprehension, in part why? Because this question of ecological validity in terms of the issues with which we're wrestling are real, and they're real sort of consequences that if the warrants underlying the knowledge that we're advocating for are not sufficiently vetted. The notion, excuse me, in terms of the logics of research and the value, for example, of RCT and large-scale databases certainly is powerful at one level methodologically, but at the same time, the huge issues about how sampling is done and what's in the nature of the error message that's not really accounted for. You could get it because you've got a large sample size, but there's still some variation going in there, and attending to variation tends to be not part of the logic that we're really valuing in this work. So I'm arguing that just as in the natural sciences, ecological validity means that, for example, in work in biology leading on the health issues, if the nature of the vaccines that are put out result in 50% of the people dying, then clearly it's a problem. So there's an issue in social science research that many of which contribute to our work in education, that we haven't really dealt with the nature of the complexity of what it means to be human in human learning and development. And I want to sort of address that in the next phase of my talk in terms of the question of the knowledge that we are wrestling with in the infrastructures that we're talking about. So I think that there is a fundamental, that we're at an important point in time where I think there are important convergences emerging across disciplines that suggest that there's a complexity around human learning and development, that the siloed ways in which we try to account for this don't take into account. And that has to do with relationships between physiological processes, sort of psychological functioning, and participation in cultural context. And pretty much, I think, historically, we have looked at these as sort of separate bins with different disciplines sort of contributing to them. But in fact of the matter, I think the convergence is that these are intersecting dynamic systems, and what it means to create opportunities through these knowledge structures that we talk about to wrestle with the notion of dynamic systems in human development that involve these multiple intersecting aspects, I think is important. So I think that there are big ideas that are emerging from work in cognition, work in human development, in the neurosciences and cultural psychology, studies of ecological systems, studies of dynamic systems that converge around a set of big ideas, which I can't see. But basically, let me go to the next slide, which I can see a little bit better. The silos that we work in, but the notion essentially that human functioning is an outgrowth of thinking, sort of cognition, if you will, perceptions of experience, perceptions of the self, and feelings and emotions. And they're all intertwined in ways that are dynamic and that are very much context specific. There are a lot of work, I think, that's happening now that's trying to make claims about the importance of executive functioning and problems with kids living in poverty around executive functioning, a whole new focus on work on social emotional learning, as though somehow that these exist as entities that are stable and context independent, when in fact they are highly interdependent and they are very much context dependent. So that performance, whether we're thinking about in the context of schooling, for kids, for teachers, or whomever it may be, trying to understand, and this is why Chris's work talking about looking at people's participation across a variety of activity settings becomes really important, because these fundamental issues about human learning that in education we're concerned about are very much context dependent and are very much intertwined with people's participation across multiple kinds of systems and the relationships between those systems. And that these aspects that are contributing to this nexus of our thinking, our feeling, and our perceptions sometimes are an outgrowth of personality differences. So in the process of looking at people's participation in communities or cultural communities, we can't forget individual variation. But all of these are also very much influenced by the context. What kinds of supports are there in a variety of systems in which people are participating, and how those are interacted, and how they also get filtered both through the perceptions of the individual, but also the resources that are available through conundrums that are out there. One big one having to do with conceptions about this idea and notion of race. This fundamental conundrum that we have about these assumptions of hierarchies of human communities also get reified in terms of knowledge structures in the general public. So this issue that had come out of Time magazine, which talked about some very interesting sort of scientific findings, if you will, about relationships between individuals and context over time, suggested that this interplay might lead to people living long lives. But the image on the front, and if you go into the magazine itself, are all white children, which suggests it has a subtle communication that's going on through this popular medium, if you will, in terms of knowledge of functioning. And again, these current exemplars that come out in this work about this real heavy emphasis now on executive functioning and non-cognitive factors, again, as though they're entities that exist irrespective of context, and the science simply doesn't inform that. In contrast to this piece that I had suggested that had really wrestles with a really complex question and has done, I think, a marvelous job of helping in a broader community-based outlet, if you will, at one level, to really wrestle with some of these fundamental dilemmas that we have dealt with. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to wrestle with how do we create knowledge structures that will facilitate syntheses across disciplines, and that's very hard work to do. But we are at a historical moment where I think the opportunities for it are very great, because a number of these disciplines that I have mentioned, working cognition and a variety of neurosciences and human development, are really converging around some shared big ideas, but we don't really typically have venues to really sort of share and wrestle with that. Attention to understanding as a fundamental object of knowledge construction in whatever technical systems we set, to understanding the value of human diversity and variation, because the argument that many have made and I've written about a lot is that that the way we are sustained through evolutionary history is by our variation, which suggests that attention to that variation should be an important object of scientific inquiry. And then finally, just attention to ecological context and development. So I'm going to close out. There's one little point I think I want to make. I think this comment here fits very much in with Chris's in terms of new methodology that are out here. But I also want to add, in terms of methodology, because I'm methodologists, and we got John and Adam here on the quantitative side, is one of the other advances, if you will, in knowledge construction, is we have technical tools in many statistical models for dealing with complexity. But my sense, on the whole, the problems that the research community on the whole is using for these models are very simplistic questions, and not really the complexities that that underlie what's really important. So with that, I'll close. Thank you.
So thank you for sticking around if you can. It's kind of strange to be on a panel because you always learn so much from different speakers. and you find yourself wishing you could do some of their work as opposed to what you present. What I want to relate to you today is I'm not from Stanford Analytica. It's Stanford University, but this is work that a lot of us have been doing with big data and data science in terms of trying to study knowledge infrastructures. So the first thing I just want to say is the angle I'm going to present to you today is as a sociologist of science who studies knowledge production. Okay? And in particular, the context that I'm going to focus on are higher education contexts. Okay? So in particular, think of interdisciplinary centers, think of universities, think of social intellectual movements, think of schools of thought, think of fields like education. Okay? And the particular argument I'm going to throw up front, and I'm trying to keep this really simple so you can remember something about what I say, is that the concrete study of these fields, or this kind of knowledge infrastructure, affords us a reflexive capacity, I think. That's the key thing. I want to say that this is important. It affords us a means of kind of being intelligent about the kind of things we design and the kind of infrastructures we're trying to put in place. Okay? So the other thing is that as we study knowledge infrastructures and we go from a small kind of unit of a department all the way up to kind of these larger intellectual movements, they get fuzzier, they get more complicated. And because of that, we have a lot of challenges to do it empirically. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to present 3 brief examples of what I have in mind of how knowledge infrastructures are studied at scale. And the first is I'm going to give you a case study of an interdisciplinary institute, or a series of them at Stanford University. And this is a case of concrete knowledge infrastructures, where a university tries to change the way people do research, change the way they produce knowledge, right, in different directions. And we have lots of path dependence within our departments and our institutions, so that's a challenge. The second one is the field of education itself. To study an entire field is a big endeavor, right? It's complicated. And there's lots of ecologies of different knowledge infrastructures going on within them. How do you study it? Wouldn't it be nice to have some kind of capacity to reflect on that as opposed to my armchair thinking of what the field is doing? It'd be nice to have some kind of broader view that isn't always biased toward one person's perspective. The last thing I want to talk about today is the potential to study translational research in particular. And I'm going to show an example of what we're trying to do in medicine in particular and try to think about it for education, okay? The nice thing about medicine, as you'll see, is there's a lot in there that you can measure and follow. It's a little more grounded for a lot of things we're after, okay? But it's just an example. So those are 3 things I'll try to go through. So the first study, this is a study that we've been doing for about 10 years at at Stanford University, and it was actually a cyber infrastructure grant from NSF. And what we did was we actually studied the university for about 20 years or so. We collected data on all the kind of research activities going on, a myriad of kinds. And then we tried to understand whether these centers, the university put $1 billion, that's a lot of money, $1 billion into changing the way research is done so that we would address more applied problems. And the president was willing to let us study the university and even show when it didn't work, okay? Because he's like, well, we put out all this stuff, it'd be nice to understand or at least learn from it. That was quite refreshing. So what do we find? We found that it actually has some centers that really succeed at this university. And those that do, they happen because the organizational rules of the university changed. They created an 8th school, the Dean of Research, where centers were not kind of under the kind of rule of a department structure. So they kind of had independence, but they didn't do training. So they kept that apart. So you didn't have poaching or kind of competition. The second thing we found was they had organic forms of intellectual collaboration. This sounds stupid, but they put coffee shops in their building. They had an open lab system. They rotated TAs and RAs. They had postdocs that were shared, et cetera, right? They had an organic form of sharing. The next thing is they had seed funding. They put nudges out there saying, hey, if you do this project that's more applied and more related to the kinds of things we're interested in, we'll fund you. And if you do it with 2 faculty and a postdoc that's shared, we'll fund it even further, right? The other thing is they gave access to technology, like particular kinds of, for me, it's like big data computing at times. I can't get access to it sometimes. And so this kind of thing is kind of putting out cat food for cats, okay? So that's the idea. Shared space as well. At Stanford, we have no space left, so it's kind of a huge resource. Finally, it's visibility. So I don't know how many of you feel like you're doing research that's really important and nobody notices it. Interdisciplinary centers put that out on the internet. They put it out with all kinds of announcements. And they also kind of go out and look for external donors. And they give you partnerships for data and kinds of research. So these are all kinds of knowledge infrastructures of sorts that they put in place to kind of encourage it. And just to give you some flavor of what happened, here's one center on the left. It's called BioX. It's at Stanford. And they do bioengineering kind of research, right? And when it first started, the big concern was they're going to take all the people away from the departments. The departments are going to collapse. And so we show the collaboration networks of the departments and the center. Over time, you see this big bird's nest form, an interactome, some of the biologists like to call it, that kind of exploded in terms of research because of the kind of things they were doing, and no effects on the departments. The department collaboration structures were kind of path-dependent and repeating, okay? The other thing is when you look at the university larger, right, we have this large collaboration network in the university, and I'm just going to color the schools that we have in the university, different kinds of cultures. You have medicine, you have natural science, and then you have social science, humanities, and of course, physical science, or engineering, right? The key thing here is that when I take out in the collaboration networks these center individuals, it breaks apart the university. And by this, what I mean is it's an integrative factor, the way they kind of generated this knowledge infrastructure. If I can get the cursor over here, you can see what happens when, ooh, you're supposed to go, ooh. That's a lot of effort in that. Anyhow, going on, the basic findings of interdisciplinary centers are, look, the first thing they did, and this is where inequality kicks in, right, is they picked workhorses. They selected heavily active people. And then what they did was, through their kinds of activities, engagements, and all their thing is, they incubated further, right? So what they did was they increased the output, the magnitude of the publication, all these kinds of outputs, the grants, et cetera, all jumped, right? Significantly more than if you had a joint appointment, a courtesy appointment, or any kind of appointment, right? Second was they increased your visibility with media mentions. You were in the news more, right? Third thing is they did breadth of activity. You were involved in inventions suddenly. You were doing practitioner kind of stuff, outreach, right? Fourth and fifth thing, move toward the topics of your research, move toward the actual concerns of that research center because of the cat food. And then last, they kind of try to integrate. So there were all these kind of big effects. It was quite impressive. We were able to actually document it. Not every institute was successful. Some of them were more monastic, like the Social Science Institute, and that wasn't as great a boost, okay? So the key thing here is even when we did supplemental analysis on seed grants, we found a big return. So even when you give a little bit of a nudge, turns out people, when they apply for a seed grant, they take that same grant and use it elsewhere, even if they don't get it. So it turned out to be sustainable. So in a lot of ways, these kind of knowledge infrastructures are very concrete. They're things you can do, seem to succeed. The one thing that's an unintended result of it is it increases inequality. So what happened at the university is you have these interdisciplinary stars. They are now the integrators of the entire university. They run big science, big team science labs, $25 million a year kind of operations. That's what's kind of guiding and leading all this. So that's the unintended consequence of it, but it's a big success on other dimensions. So you have kind of these levers in these infrastructures. You pull one and they go one way and the others don't. The next case, I want to talk about a field. A field is much harder, right? And this is work I'm doing with a brilliant graduate student. He's somewhere out here. But he's going to present tomorrow on this, or no, Monday on this paper. If you're willing to go to his session, you can see it. But the idea here is we said, what is the field of education and how does it organize? What are student tastes? How does that change over time as emergent or latent knowledge infrastructures, right? And then we asked, okay, well, how does that relate to power? How does that relate to you getting a job or becoming an advisor, right? And have those tastes changed over time? So we started looking at this as one kind of way of diving into an entire field. And it's big data. It's 140,000 PhDs that we could find on, that filed their thesis through ProQuest, which is online. And we followed them into their careers as advisors, okay? The kind of tools that we're using these days are, I try to do case studies, I do interviews as well, but when you have 140,000 documents, it helps to do natural language processing. So there's all these new data science tools that are quite interesting, quite fun, quite novel. I think you can do a lot of neat things with them. And what you can identify through latent Dirichlet allocation topic modeling is you can identify latent dimensions of language usage, right? So they're basically sub-languages, research languages. And then we kind of model those over time to see what kinds of infrastructures guide them or not. The results, again, I'm going to put these up front. The first is you can identify recognizable sub-languages. You can see latent, the things that are hidden can be revealed. And it's not just my perspective of reading 10 books and, expert views. It's 140,000, and it's their usage of language, okay? So it's kind of equalizing in a way. Next, they form research clusters. And what I'm going to show you is that the field of education actually has turned over. We've had a phase shift. You remember the paradigm wars? Well, quantitative research lost. Well, I'm going to tell you that right up front, okay? Next thing, power change. And this is the point, that taste of students changed. And what happened? Did that mean that they don't get access to the highest institutions and best jobs of like the most elite places? No. Taste changed, and good taste and qualitative work got you a job. So it's a revolution, it's a change in a field. It's not Bourdieu and social reproduction. It changed, okay? That's kind of cool, I think, as a theorist. All right, so what are the kind of topics that we identify? Going through 140,000 documents, right? You start to find bundles of words that get used, and they're things like experiments, they're methodologies, surveys, measurement, quasi-experimental research, et cetera, right? They're kind of things that you would recognize. But they're not just programs that people get degrees in, so they're also methods. The next thing you find are things like this is the qualitative set. So the first set was more quantitative, this is more qualitative. There's a reason for it. I'll show you in a second. But basically, you start to find bundles of words. People use them together. It's like thinking of a subculture, a sub-language. It's kind of your style of talk, your style of writing. And you'll see it in theses if you read them, as well as research articles. Here's the trends, though. If you look at how much people use these every year, there's a lot of fluctuation. But as you go up on the y-axis, that's the proportion of a document, each thesis, on average, that uses that topic, that bag of words. It turns out there are certain ones that totally crash, and they're experiments, and their survey methodology. And I have theories for that. It might have to do with IRBs and access and various things. But the other one that's going up is practice, teacher practice. We have grown concerned, the taste with practice over the last 30 years. And on top of that, you see interview, qualitative interview, okay? So now if you start to look at, so taste flip. Graduate students voted with their feet, okay? But if you look at how these things are co-occurring, how you use topics together within a document, within a thesis, which ones go together, you start to see regimes, you start to see clusters, right? So you see quantitative methods kind of up here. People tend to combine them in certain ways. Down here you see more qualitative practitioner kind of methods put together, right? They kind of co-occur within theses. They have more similarities, right? Now, this is a little more complicated. Now if I relate it to your career, right? What taste you have related to your career, okay? So the bottom x-axis, if you go to the right, that's the most popular topics. So the most popular topics on the far right here. So you see experiments, that's very popular. Theory at the top is very popular. Performance evaluation is popular. Teacher practice is popular. The y dimension is whether you become a professor or not, okay? And I made, what we did was we made the triangle, the cluster of topics that rise, the good taste. And you notice how they're all kind of getting you a job? And they're all geared toward more elite jobs even. So this is signs for us. I mean, we're still kind of the modeling of what kind of infrastructures guide this, whether it's funding, whether it's demographic shifts within the field. We think all of those things have to deal with why these changes occur. But what's going on is kind of basically an upswing in topics toward qualitative research, okay? So a phase shift in what taste matters and has influence, okay? So that's that's the preliminary findings for this kind of study. It's you could take these big data, find sublanguages, there are latent dimensions, hidden kinds of cultures of infrastructure. You can find research clusters that reflect paradigmatic shifts of larger shape. You can even see phase shifts if you plot them over time. And then last, you see a power change if you actually relate it to social reproduction power, right? A job, something concrete. There's lots of problems, though, with doing field-level research. There's challenges, like there's bias in every sample you pick. You're going to have bias. If I do articles, I miss all the book people, right? If I do books, I miss the fast science of conference proceedings if you're a technologist. Each one of these, and they change, right? What's represented? I'm starting to think more and more the bias is the data. We're biased. Represent the bias. Show it. Be reflexive about it. Explain that. That's our constantly reflect on it. The scaling is a big issue here, right? A lot of the methods that we want to use to kind of analyze big data is difficult. It's kind of how to scale it. We have to take time to figure this out. I think if we want to have field reflexivity, our capacity to reflect on what we're doing as we do it, we need to kind of confront some of those things. And then finally, focus, right? There's so many different knowledge infrastructures out there. There's so many different mechanisms that are driving knowledge production. Which are the most important? Because we can literally throw a kitchen sink out of it and make it idiosyncratic for every case. So thinking about that a little more deeply for us is kind of one of our missions. Now, last thing I want to talk about is translational research at scale. Okay? Oh, geez. So one of the things, just real quick, we want to identify pathways from basic research to practice and recipes, right? And so the kind of things that we're thinking about is, look, a bunch of knowledge infrastructures are interrelated, right? The kind of things that are being done at practice, right, are kind of guided, particularly for education, by a textbook company, has something to do with this. Much like for medicine, pharma does, or biotechnology industry does, in terms of what drug or technology you get. All those things kind of matter. We don't have data on that, right? But they're all part of this. They take up. It's not like educators can do everything, or education researchers can do every phase of the infrastructure work, okay? So the goal is to kind of think about this. For medicine, it looks like this. I don't know what it's going to look like for education, because in particular, this last cell is something that's hard to get access to and have systematic information on it. Okay? But we can look at patents for educational patents, and we can see whether they become products that are actually used in schools, potentially. So we have some kind of pipeline. You have comparative kinds of lenses that you could study through. So hopefully that's something we think about, and this gets to the last part. I really think the key thing here is that I can bring is hopefully thinking about this in really concrete examples, trying to ground it in data that we can track the actual relationships of knowledge infrastructures, and that we can kind of develop some kind of reflexive capacity, right? Meaning like we can be intelligent about what we're doing, see results to it as we go through it. And there are a bunch of challenges, of course. What's knowledge? We try to look at language as knowledge. Who are the agents? We try to show that students decide quite a bit. Where are they in knowledge infrastructures? And finally, pathways of translation, I think, is a kind of a key thing. Like if we could identify really good cases of translation, reverse engineer them, and kind of come up with good kind of models and studies of those, that would be terrific. And then we can go to the bigger data and kind of start to model that out and think about what other kinds of supports facilitate that further. So thank you.
I get too engaged in what's going on here. And I think what we're going to do at this point is have dialogue with you. We have until 6:05, so that leaves us 15 minutes for dialogue and maybe a little interchange on the panel, but we want to hear what your questions are. I hope these are useful pump primers, but we're interested in any comment or question that you want to raise. Yes, sir. And please speak loudly.
So thank you so much for sharing thinking of reimagining knowledge infrastructure. But the question is, and even you have to all put some kind of introspect. We are discussing or thinking of creating knowledge infrastructure, and some of you also alluded to the term diverse and whatever.
Somebody want to? You're right.
I'll just repeat the question in case there is anybody on the internet watching the webinar. The question was, if we're constructing knowledge infrastructures that are leaving out non-dominant communities, then they're not inclusive. And so what can be done about that? I can't think of anybody better than Chris Gutierrez to answer that question.
Oh my gosh, I think that's what I tried to talk about. Wow. What can we do? Well, I was starting from a position of bringing it to our community. What can we do as researchers, right, to ensure that we are documenting the variation in kinds of knowledge and practices that people in communities have? I mean, that's just one really critical point, right? That as researchers, we're responsible for contributing to that knowledge base. Whose knowledge gets taken up in the academy is a big question, and who's not, right? So even within that structure, there are these inequities. But I always look to my own local community as a researcher. What are the commitments that I need to make to help ensure that that I'm again making visible where those inequities are, right? And how to remediate them. And I think that really takes. That's a sad thing about, we've both been president of AERA, so we can say this. I think that we're so siloed, and I think this calls for such a transdisciplinary kind of approach, working across networks, working across fields, working in large teams, in smaller teams, to really kind of do the kind of work that this demands, and not these just silos that we continue to perpetuate in the academy.
One thing that may be worth adding, infrastructure happens. Whether we make intentional design moves or not. And so part of the goal of Bowker's infrastructural inversion is to at least make it transparent, to at least make it visible, so that we can engage in dialogue and debate about the consequences and consider what other alternatives are possible.
I just want to briefly add, though, I still think that there is another very foundational question, and that is, what are the basic assumptions we have, in this case, about the science of human learning, so that all the variation across different communities at some point ought to be contributing to our understanding of what makes humans function, why we do what we do. How do we maximize that? And I think that a fundamental problem, besides the technical issue of the structures and how many communities have, is really the wrestling with this fundamental set of fundamental assumptions about human learning and development, and forms of work that we do. Otherwise, we could go into different communities and still bring the same set of simplistic assumptions about human learning.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, in a similar vein, one of the more troubling realities of infrastructures historically is the ways in which profit as the single motive of creating infrastructure sort of creates this sort of horrific history. And I wonder if there are ways in which, as researchers and practitioners, we can, if there are sort of subtle or non-subtle ways to resist that sort of impulse toward profit-making in sort of knowledge infrastructure. So the ugly example of Cambridge Analytica is very much a story of somebody trying to profit off of this pile of data. So, and net neutrality, right, is another example of the profit impulse and how it sort of pollutes the noble ambition of creating information infrastructure. And so how do we, as we think about whatever small amount of agency we have in choosing and building infrastructure, how do we resist the urge to cash in or sell out?
So following up on Adam's good example, the question is, how do we resist the urge of resist the urge of economic pull around infrastructure issues. Yes, Adam?
Well, the research practice partnerships that both John and I spoke about are partnerships between university researchers and public agencies, in the case of school districts, or it could be private nonprofits, explicitly rejecting a profit motive, embracing the public mission of the university. So many universities talk about serving the public good, but they're also driven by the kind of imperatives that you described. You know, universities have budgets, and they're trying to raise money. And so what is often part of the rhetoric doesn't turn out that way in practice. But the research practice partnerships that we're describing are cases where universities are driven to work with nonprofits or public agencies, typically in their local communities, to ask research questions whose answers matter to public service. And we are arguing that universities need to find ways to value and appreciate and esteem the contributions of researchers who are doing that work, and that it should be counted not as service, which is how it's typically counted, and they're marginalized, but rather as research contributions for their for what they offer to decision making in the public sector as valuable in their own right.
Well, I agree with you. What I've found is that following, I think, your point about the pick the workforces. So what happens is that you pick these researchers of color and women who do the work of the connection to community and building the knowledge, and then when it comes time for tenure, they're told they're doing activism or service, not research, and you get a continued, but they'll be the person on the pamphlet. They'll be the person on the picture on the web page to say what a good university we are doing all this service work. And I think that's problematic, and it just reproduces, because fundamentally there's an epistemological injustice going on about who counts as a knowledge producer. And even if you're on the ground with community doing this work authentically, the university doesn't value it. They just pretend to value it. And unless you're, in my case, a full professor already, you can't get tenure doing this work.
So actually, I didn't have time, surprisingly. I took a lot of it. But we're studying the whole university, and there's different valuations of research within universities, kind of like Bourdieu shows for, academics. You have an intellectual kind of, public intellectual kind of dimension of valuation, which is about teaching, about being in the media, right? Being involved in kind of practitioner stuff is one dimension, and it seems to be related to tenure, particularly for humanities and for education at Stanford. And then another dimension, which is more like STEM fields, which is about this production, this kind of, but I don't want to vilify it too much, because in some ways a lot of good has come of this selection, like people select to do it, they choose to, it's like an extra curriculum, right? It's like they put out this kind of thing there, and if you want to, you can do it. And what that does is some people are able to do extraordinary amounts. I don't know how they survive or don't have a mental breakdown doing as much work as they do, but it has positive effects. This work inequity that you see at Stanford for the STEM fields has resulted in a brilliant set of things that solve a lot of health issues. So I don't want to it's not as clear cut as a vilification, but it does have inequalities of production. And the other thing I do want to say is that the university is more dimensional than pure production and valuation of kind of churning out a ton of stuff. There's another dimension of that isn't the same kind of value that we see.
If I could just add on that, let's also not forget the profit motive and the power struggles within public school systems.
And one of the other points that you raised about different kinds of research and different ways in which research is valued, particularly the issue of activism and how that takes on, how that can become and be seen as a worthwhile and important dimension of research and where we draw the line. Should there be a line? There currently is. Should there be a line between activism and research? So that's another important dimension, I think, in your question. Yes?
I guess my question is, how does this change how we teach? How does this change what we are studying? As a K-12 educator myself, I'm looking at this and I'm looking at the building I'm in, looking at the infrastructure my students are working with and working in. And it's built itself up to be discouraging. It's built itself up to almost inhibit their process forward. And so how do I take this and put it in my classroom?
So the question is, how does this change how we teach?
Well, I don't know if this, so I should say, spoiler alert, I don't have an answer for you.
Good, that's good.
But what I will say is that I think it's exemplary of the way that we've normally thought that we collectively and school boards and school administrators, who often do very well by promoting new technologies in school systems, all of that puts all the power and credit and privilege to the people who build systems, right? Or the people who are the visionary adopters. And if the previous superintendent adopted an old system, I'd better adopt a new system because I don't get credit for continuing his old system. And I think that really speaks to the ongoingness of infrastructure and the real work. I mean, 99% of knowledge infrastructure, even in its technical guise, is made up of teachers making the damn things work well enough in a classroom, right? So that's really where the rubber meets the road continuously. And one of the reasons that we want to tell wider and different stories about infrastructure is, I mean, it gets back to the invisible work point that Chris had raised earlier, is to ensure that our sort of general cultural stories, but also our institutional stories around infrastructure, can't continue to forget that fact. Because if they continue to forget that fact, we end up with people who are undercompensated for their work, not receiving the credit they deserve for the real work of maintaining institutions, including the outreach functions that came up in an earlier question, the partnerships. And we end up with crappy systems. We end up with things that just don't support learning because they don't out of the box. They simply don't.
Just
Yes,
one
sir.
quick
Sorry.
Carol, question. I think that there are models, for example, lesson study in Japan where there's a professional shared cultural practice that research around teaching and learning is local in the context of the school, and it is driven by teachers who then invite external partners for the services that they have articulated. So I think a sort of re-envisioning around the notion of what does teaching entail would address your question. The other is about even this activism piece. The learning sciences, Northwestern started the first PhD program, and Anne Brown had talked about this, that the transition, if you will, from sort of traditional ed psych to learning sciences was about trying to examine fundamental theories of human learning in real world context. If you're studying, fundamental theories of human learning in real world context, that's not service, that's research.
Yes, sir.
I just wonder where, at the end of this, and this last question, really, I think.
We got 2 minutes.
Yep. With the availability of technology that in the infrastructure, the social infrastructure research practitioner partnerships, it sounds to me like one of the gates that could be opened is that at every face of the work, students as learners and as innovators, teachers as learners and as innovators, everybody as researchers, is the ability to define. Typically the measures come from the top. If it's from the teachers down to the student, from the district down to the teacher. The ability to define part of the ontology going up, right? The infrastructure actually exists now for kids to co-create the measurement system, for teachers to co-create. So I listen to all of this and I've been working this for 25 years. I'm actually hearing this as glasses half full, where I haven't for lots of years studying the AERA. So I really enjoy the panel, but that, am I just, is this a false hope of mine? That we're actually potentially at a place where we could have really research practitioner partnerships with real teeth, where the people at the front edge of the work actually have a really big say in what is knowable, what's doable, what's measurable?
So just a brief answer, I think it is a viable hope. I don't think the proof of concept is demonstrated yet, but when my colleague Vivian Sang speaks of the democratization of evidence, that's exactly what she means. She means that everyone has a say in what counts as evidence.
Well, I'm afraid that does need to be the last question, so I want to thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the panel. And I hope we've given you some questions to ponder and some ideas about how to contribute to this dialogue.